Chapter 24. Continuing the lesson, Guion explained, the mana training scriptures inherited by the collateral lines all share their roots in the inferior red flame formula. Over the long 300 years since the first collateral line had split off, the red flame formula inherited by each collateral line had gone through various improvements. By now, the mana training scriptures inherited by the oldest collateral houses bore almost no resemblance to their original form. However, the modified versions of the red flame formula still could not reach the full power of the white flame formula. Even after such a long period of development, the knockoffs still couldn't overcome the original. The combined wisdom and effort of entire lines of descendants couldn't compete with that of the Great Vermouth. The Lionheart clan's direct line was well aware of this fact. As such, they hadn't altered the white flame formula to be in any way different from its original form because there was no need to make any changes in the first place. What reason was there to add to something that was already perfect? You will be learning the white flame formula, said Guion. Distracted from staring blankly into Guion's flame as he had been so far, Eugene nodded eagerly at these words. Although the name white flame formula was unfamiliar to him, he couldn't be more familiar with its appearance. It was a sight that had caused him to feel frustration more than a few times in his past life. Until the very end, Hamel hadn't been able to surpass the power of these flames. Eugene sighed to himself. He could feel the echoes of bitterness lingering from his past. However, this did nothing to cool the burning excitement in his heart. Guion continued, of course you won't be able to learn it right away. You'll need to be able to sense mana first. I can already feel it. Urged on by his excitement, Eugene didn't have the patience to keep listening until the end and instead chose to interrupt Guion. Guion grunted in confusion. I said that I can already feel the mana, Eugene repeated. Guion was speechless as he stared at Eugene for a moment, his eyes blinking in disbelief. Then he burst out laughing at the absurd claim. That's just an illusion, Guion corrected Eugene. He understood how Eugene could have come to make such a mistake. Once you got too absorbed into something, it was easy for strange delusions to arise in your head. It's true, Eugene insisted. Guion hummed as he wondered how he should convince Eugene that he was mistaken. After a few moments of contemplation, Guion gently prodded his mana. Then, according to Guion's will, an intangible wisp of mana moved and hovered at Eugene's side. When Eugene remained silent, Guion smiled and said, See. It's too early for you to. It's here, Eugene said, pointing to his left thigh. The mana has gathered in this location. Guion's face froze as he was struck dumb. No way, it couldn't be. Guion moved his mana once more. This time, instead of focusing it in one place, he dispersed it. A light stream of mana curled around Eugene's body. Here, over there, up and now down. How long do you want me to keep this up? Eugene asked as his hand kept moving around to follow the flow of mana. Each time he got it correct, Guion's jaw dropped even further. Eventually, Guion took a few steps back and shook his head violently. This is unbelievable, Guion muttered in shock. But perhaps this was just a sign that Eugene's 5 senses were unusually developed. Guion changed the movements of the mana. Instead of allowing it to touch Eugene's body directly, he had the mana move further away. Over there. But even with that, Eugene was able to point in the direction of the mana without any hesitation. Guion was struck by a dizzying sense of vertigo. Was this even possible? A 13-year-old kid who had yet to train his mana, who had never received any training to develop his sense for mana, was able to feel the mana as soon he tried? Guion tried to speak, but words failed him. They hadn't even gotten to the part where Guion was going to flow mana directly into Eugene's body. Eugene had learned how to sense mana all on his own. If Eugene had been able to sense mana after 10 days with his assistance, Guion would have already called that quick. But Eugene was so fast that it was unbelievable. Guion finally broke out of his stupor and walked over to Eugene while shaking his head. Although these words might seem a little rude, how great would it have been if you were born to the main family? I've been adopted into it, haven't I? Eugene asked. Adopted? You're right. That's good enough, Guion agreed with a wry smile. Guion sat down in front of Eugene and held his hands so that their arms formed a circle. If you can already feel the mana, then we can begin right away. From now on, just focus on what is happening inside your body without getting distracted, Guion told Eugene seriously. Yes, sir, said Eugene obediently. Guillaume began transmitting the white flame formula. Eugene closed his eyes and turned his concentration inwards. Soon, mana began flowing into his body through Guillaume's hands. The mana leaped across the points where their hands were joined and then scattered into numerous branches within Eugene's body. His body had never before taken in any mana. However, Eugene's body seemed to be able to absorb mana well, to an almost unbelievable extent. This fact surprised Guillaume once again. Guillaume muttered to himself, "He's a genius." No, this is... Guillaume's eyes wavered. He adjusted the flow of mana that he was sending into Eugene to be a little stronger. He was going to teach Eugene how to breathe in mana, not the physical technique equivalent. Guillaume led Eugene into becoming conscious of the mana that was in the air he breathed in and then helped him memorize how to flow this mana through his body according to a set pattern, thus forming the mana breathing cycle. Eugene concentrated on feeling how the mana was flowing within his body. As the mana spread throughout his body, it formed a center at his heart. The mana converged around his heart and then settled into the blood vessels connected to the heart. Mana began flowing back out along with his blood. Although they flowed together, the movement of his mana didn't completely follow the circulation system of his blood. "He's a monster," Guillaume finished his earlier thought. Guillaume slowly cut off the flow of mana that he was infusing into Eugene. However, the circulation of mana within Eugene's body didn't stop, following the withdrawal of Guillaume's mana. This showed that Eugene was already able to independently adjust the flow of mana within his own body. He was even making sure not to rush, going slowly so that his body had time to get used to it. Guillaume couldn't help but feel even further surprised that Eugene was able to accomplish this much. "Make sure not to stop breathing," Guillaume eventually managed to squeeze out in a shaking voice. "Imagine that you're breathing in the ley line's mana with each breath you take. Yes, like that. Take the mana you've breathed in and guide it to follow the circulation path set by the white flame formula. Back now, back to the heart." Eugene's face showed no response. He was concentrating all his attention on memorizing the flow of mana. Then, as he breathed in more mana, he guided this inhaled mana into his heart. Guillaume was no longer holding Eugene's hands. Unable to close his gaping mouth, he stood up and took a few steps back. "That's right, you're doing very well." The words that slowly fell from his lips seemed ridiculous to Guillaume. Doing well. How were these words enough to describe what was happening? It was just that he didn't know what else he could say, forcing him to babble something inane like that. With each breath he took, Eugene was sending ripples through the rich mana of the ley line. Since Eugene had just initiated his mana, there was a tight limit to the amount of mana his body could accept. Or at least that was how it should have been. However, Eugene was currently in the middle of breaking that piece of common sense into pieces. "This is insane." Guillaume wasn't the only one feeling astonished. Eugene was also surprised by the performance of this body that he had been reincarnated into. Because he had the memories of his past life, sensing mana wasn't difficult for him. That applied to forming the mana breathing cycle as well. However, even with all that, his body was absorbing mana with surprising ease. It was to the extent where he could feel the mana stored within his body increasing significantly with each breath. Of course, even a small increase would seem significant when he didn't have any mana in his body in the first place. Still, no matter how good his sensitivity to mana was, it was a fact that his mana absorption rate exceeded all expectations. "But it looks like I still have limits," Eugene finally realized. There was an inevitable end to the amount of mana that this young body could absorb. After being immersed in concentration for quite some time, Eugene opened his mouth and released a long sigh as he opened his eyes. His whole body felt sticky from being drenched in sweat. "Ha," Eugene laughed in satisfaction. Eugene had been in this focused state for a good long while. Although the length of time was actually shorter than Guillaume had expected their first session to be, what Eugene had managed to accomplish during these few hours broke all of Guillaume's beliefs and certainties. The mana of the ley line had actually thinned enough that a difference could be felt. Although it would recover with time, this was a sign that Eugene had absorbed as much mana as his body could possibly handle in just a few hours. Cyan, Seal, and Yuid had taken several days just to sense mana. Then it took them a lot longer to absorb mana into their bodies and eventually form a core from it. That went for Guillaume as well. Eugene, however, had been able to sense mana as soon as he took a seat and, immediately after forming the mana breathing cycle, had gathered the mana around his heart in order to form his core. Eugene had even managed the whole process without much help from Guillaume. All Gion had done was provide an initial influx of mana and transmit the flow pattern of the white flame formula. The size of his core is also alarming, Gion observed. It was so large that it was impossible to believe that Eugene had just initiated his mana. If you didn't know Eugene's circumstances, the size might lead you to believe that he'd been training his mana for a few years now. It's usually much smaller than that, but when Gion had first started training his mana, his core was much smaller than Eugene's, but as he diligently trained his mana, the size of his core grew larger. So you really are a monster, Gion finally managed to choke out the words. While wiping away the sweat running down his cheeks, Eugene smiled calmly and asked, "That's a compliment, right?" "It's definitely a compliment," Gion muttered in a dull tone as he gave Eugene a hand up. "Well, let's start heading back." Gion's thoughts were preoccupied with a single question: how exactly should he explain what had just happened to his brother? "Thanks, Vermouth," Eugene smiled as he thought of this comrade from his previous life. Eugene continued to learn more about the white flame formula on the way back. The biggest difference between the white flame formula and the red flame formula was the former's ability to split off part of the original core to form a new core. No matter how much you developed and trained in the red flame formula, in the end, you could only have a single mana core inside your body. However, when the white flame formula grew past a certain level, the core would split into two. In this way, the body would become able to absorb even more mana, and the split cores could resonate with each other to amplify both cores' power. Each of these cores, both the original and the one that had split off, were called stars, and the number of stars you had reached marked your progress in the white flame formula. The Great Vermouth, the progenitor of the Lionheart clan and creator of the white flame formula, had held 10 stars in his body. In the entire history of the Lionheart clan, Vermouth was the only one who had managed to reach the 10th star of the white flame formula. "Both my brother and I are at the 6th star," Gion revealed. This seemed like nothing next to the Great Vermouth. However, in the history of the Lionheart clan, the number of people who had managed to reach the 6th star of the white flame formula could be counted on one hand. Cyan, Seal and Yuid are all at the 1st star. Although I'm not sure about Yuid, the twins should reach the 2nd star after a year or so. Gion cited as an example of how fast progress in the white flame formula usually was. "What about me?" Eugene asked. "I really can't tell," Gion replied with a wry smile. The unbelievable sight he had seen back at the ley line caused Gion to answer very cautiously out of fear of having to eat his words. Gion continued the lecture. "In my case, it took me 8 years to go from the 1st star to the 2nd star. It was around the same for my brother. Since Cyan and Seal initiated their mana when they were 6, if they managed to reach the 2nd star by next year, it would have taken them 8 years. Just like my brother and me. Then will it take me 8 years as well?" Eugene guessed. "No," came the immediate reply. Although he couldn't guess how long it would take Eugene, Gion felt certain as he said, "You'll be a lot faster than that." Gion could at least be confident of this belief. In the records of the Lionheart clan, there had never been a child who was able to sense mana and begin practicing the white flame formula as fast as Eugene. At the moment, just looking at Eugene's core, it seemed to be bigger than Cyan's when the boy was 10. "It definitely won't take you 8 years. Well, as long as you don't become lazy, that is," Gion reminded Eugene. "I'll make sure to work hard," Eugene replied with a grin. As if Eugene would be lazy, there was no way he would do something as brain-dead as that. Now that he had been reincarnated into a body that was overwhelmingly better than the one from his previous life, he didn't want such a body to go to waste out of his own slothfulness. "On top of that, I've even learned Vermouth's mana training scripture," Eugene mused in excitement. How often had he been left feeling frustrated by that damned white flame and the shining lion's mane that had sped ahead of him? Until the very end, stupid Hamel had never been able to surpass Vermouth. No matter how hard he had worked, he had never been able to match Vermouth in strength. But now, was it possible for him to catch up to Vermouth? After some thought, Eugene decided, no way. Eugene didn't want to just match the hero. What he had always wanted, was to surpass Vermouth. It wasn't for the sake of bragging rights. He had never even thought about doing something like that. You should be grateful for your hard-earned strength and make sure to use it properly. Why do needless shit like that and waste your own hard work? For now, I should just focus on learning all I can about the white flame formula. I'm not sure if I'll be able to reach it. Of course, There was no way that Eugene was just going to follow the lesson plan obediently. Although he would have to try and dig deep into the structure of the white flame formula first. If there was anything that didn't quite suit him, then he would make his own adaptations to fix it. Guess I'll have to deconstruct it as I'm learning it. Hamel's abilities weren't as exceptional as Vermouth's. Eugene was well aware of this fact. Still, his inherited abilities were better than most people's, and they could perhaps even be better than those of the previous Lionheart patriarchs. Although I'll have to give it a go to know for sure. He would have to try out various ideas based on the original white flame formula. Now that he had initiated his mana, Eugene was currently capable of doing much more than he could before. I'll explain things to the patriarch. As for you, you must be tired, so go get a good rest. With these words, Eugene parted ways with Guillaume in front of the annex. Eugene sent Guillaume off with a bright smile. Eugene had clearly heard the order to go and rest. Truthfully speaking, his body was quite tired. Although his body wouldn't let out a single protest no matter how much abuse he put it through, just absorbing a lot of unfamiliar mana was enough to make it feel exhausted. However, Eugene had no intention of resting. Since there was no one to tell him otherwise, why should he rest? This kind of fatigue would get better with just a full night's sleep anyway. First of all, why don't we go have a look at my new abilities? Eugene thought to himself. Eugene pulled off his sweat-drenched clothes and tossed them aside. Nina, who had come running out of the annex, stopped and stiffened as she saw his current appearance before turning around and heading back inside. This was because Nina realized that she needed to go and fetch a few necessary items for Eugene, such as a new set of clothes, a towel, and a wash basin. As she was leaving, Nina turned her head and called out, "Ah. Hold on, Master Eugene. What would you like for dinner?" "Meat," came the answering shout. "Yes, Master." It was just as she had expected. Nina ran back into the annex, hurrying to prepare for Eugene's unexpected return. Eugene stood still and turned his attention to the core inside his body. From its appearance, it truly deserved to be called a star. Created through the flow of mana guided by the white flame formula, the core centered around his heart looked as if all the stars in the night sky had gathered into a sparkling sphere. "It's small," Eugene frowned. It was so small that it couldn't even be compared to the one he had in his previous life, but this wasn't something to be disappointed about. At 13, Hamel had yet to even initiate his mana. At that time, Hamel was just trying to survive. When he was young, Hamel had lived in a village frequently attacked by monsters, a small village at that. There had only been occasional attacks in the beginning, but by the time Hamel turned 10, the attacks had become more frequent and even more ferocious. In order to protect the village, everyone needed to know how to fight the monsters. So all the adults carried weapons like swords and axes, and the children held smaller versions of these weapons. Hamel was like that as well. As soon as he received a weapon, he had learned various ways of fighting. But then before too long the village was destroyed. The reason behind the steady intensification of monster attacks was the demon kings of Helmuth. Finally, a sudden assault wiped out the village and left a young Hamel as the only survivor. "At least my current circumstances are incomparably better than my past life," Eugene thought as he tried to shake off the bad memories. Eugene had initiated his mana earlier than he had in his previous life, and he had even learned Vermouth's white flame formula. Due to these facts, it didn't make sense to compare the current size of his core with the core he had first cultivated in his past life. Eugene shook off his melancholic feelings and focused on the star around his heart. He began moving his mana, allowing it to flow alongside his blood, but also in different directions. While maintaining the flow of the white flame formula, Eugene started warming up his body. Soon Eugene was nodding with a satisfied expression. "Looks good," he decided. "Just because your core had a lot of mana, that didn't mean you were strong. What was important was how you used that mana." The white flame formula also strictly abided by this principle. Even with this meager amount of mana, his body movements had already improved noticeably. From there, Eugene tried applying the experiences obtained from his previous life. He had always had a knack for handling mana, and he knew just how to maximize his power. Pow! A clenched fist burst through the air with a bang. Although he had only punched once, his muscles and bones already felt numb. Even though Eugene hadn't neglected his physical training, he had yet to familiarize himself with the amplifying effect that mana had on the body. "This is something that I'll just need to gradually get used to." After moving his body around a few more times, Eugene concluded that he wasn't able to create sword light yet. Although he might be able to succeed if he forcefully tried to squeeze some out, he didn't want to do something like that so soon. If I pointlessly deplete my core, even taking a day off won't be enough for me to recover. Just like how you could get serious health problems by overworking your body, the same went for the core as well. If he used up all his mana, his core would be depleted, placing a corresponding burden on his body. Master Eugene, Nina called out as she approached. After setting a heavy water basin down on the ground, she didn't pause to catch her breath and immediately started wiping Eugene's body with a dry towel. Eugene stood still, allowing her to work as he continued to think. I might be able to make a contract now, he pondered uncertainly. He had gone through all sorts of things in his previous life, but he had never signed a contract with a spirit. So Eugene was currently unsure if he could summon a spirit with the minimal amount of mana he had now. Stand back a little, Eugene ordered. Yes, Nina immediately skirted backward with a nod of her head. Eugene slowly took a deep breath as he drew WMWD. The bluish-silver blade slid out of its sheath with a smooth ring. Nina's shoulder trembled as she was startled by this sight. After taking a few more deep breaths, Eugene began drawing mana away from his core. Let's give it a try, he thought with anticipation. He had never learned any sort of magic, let alone spirit magic. So he couldn't predict the amount of mana it would take to summon something. As such, he had no choice but to try blindly. The mana from his core flowed into WMYD. The star revolving around his heart began to shine. Strangely, even though he couldn't see this, he could feel this happening to the star deep inside his body. WNYD's blade trembled. The magic sword began to hungrily devour all the mana Eugene was feeding it. Sweat once again dripped down from his body, which had just been wiped clean. The blade emitted a soft light, and a gentle breeze started to whirl around Eugene. Ah! Nina gasped in shock upon seeing such a sight. As the wind gradually grew stronger, it began fluttering Eugene's hair. His mouth had dried up out of tension, but Eugene clenched his teeth and continued to infuse his mana into the blade. Roar! At some point the gentle breeze began turning into a violent storm. Nina jolted in surprise and drew back even further. However, the one that was most surprised was Eugene. What was going on? The wind was already so strong that he couldn't even open his eyes properly, but it was still growing stronger. Even though WMYD wasn't taking in any more mana, Eugene felt something like a door appear inside of his body. This door opened slowly, and as the opening grew wider, the wind grew even stronger. By now, the wind blowing around Eugene had formed a tornado. You are. In the center of this tornado, Eugene lifted his head to look around. The fiercely blowing wind seemed to be carrying a voice that was speaking inside of Eugene's head. Could it really be? Are you really Hamel? Eugene's heart started pounding as he tried to find out where this voice was coming from. Is that you, Tempest? He asked. Tempest was the wind spirit king who had bestowed his protection onto the storm sword WE. Eugene had seen Vermouth summon him a few times in his previous life. How could it be you? Could it really be that you've reincarnated? Eugene began responding to Tempest in his head. You old fucker, how could you tell it was me? As Vermouth's companion, how could I forget the appearance of your soul? 300 years had flown by and even his face had changed, but his soul was still the same. Spirits weren't beings of the material plane. So the wind spirit king Tempest had easily recognized Hamel by his soul. It looks like you also remember me. How on earth did you get here? I wasn't trying to summon you, Eugene demanded. It's been a long time since I last heard WNYD's call. I was curious to see which of Vermouth's descendants had been chosen to wield it, but then I felt a familiar soul. The wind slowly began to die down. As it did, static began to interfere with Tempest's voice as it echoed inside his head. How could this be? For someone to be reincarnated with their old memories, and as Vermouth's descendant at that? And it's Hamel of all people? Why didn't Vermouth kill the remaining demon kings? Eugene suddenly asked. How had he been reincarnated? Eugene had no idea. He had died in the castle of the demon king of incarceration, and by the time he had come to his senses, he was already in the body of a wailing newborn baby. Tell me, Tempest, didn't you accompany them on the rest of their journey through the Devildom? Why are the demon king of incarceration and the demon king of destruction still alive after 300 years? I don't know why Vermouth made that decision, Tempest replied. The only thing I know is that, in the decisive battle with the Demon King of Incarceration, Vermouth sheathed his sword. What? Eugene exclaimed. I don't know exactly what happened at that moment. Tempest's voice was getting harder to hear. Their fight at that time was fierce but ultimately futile. In the end, only Vermouth and the Demon King of Incarceration were left standing. At the final moment, Vermouth put down his sword and refused to kill the Demon King of Incarceration. Neither did he go on to the castle of the Demon King of Destruction. Their journey ended at the castle of the Demon King of Incarceration. Don't bullshit me, Eugene growled through clenched teeth. Their journey had just ended here? According to the stories, the hero Vermouth and his companions had driven the Demon King of Incarceration to the brink of death. However, the Demon King of Incarceration had managed to escape without dying and begged the Demon Lord of Destruction for help. During Hamel's death, Vermouth had sworn an oath that he would kill all of the Demon Kings. Of course, Eugene hadn't been around to hear such an oath, but all the fairy tales agreed on this. So the hero's party had headed onwards to the castle of the Demon King of Incarceration. However, they could not defeat the two Demon Kings who had joined forces and instead forced them to swear an oath to bring peace to the world. Like I said, don't bullshit me, Eugene demanded as the taste of blood filled his mouth and his head grew dizzy. What the fuck is with that oath? Why did they make such an oath? Why? Vermouth sheathed his sword? Instead of killing the Demon King of Incarceration? I don't know anything about that oath or why Vermouth made such a decision. So what do you know, you son of a bitch? Only those who were there know what kind of oath was made. From the moment that Vermouth put away his sword, I could no longer intervene in that situation. Those who were there. Didn't you say that no one was left standing there apart from Vermouth and the Demon King of Incarceration? Doesn't that mean everyone else lost consciousness? Are you asking me to dig up Vermouth's corpse and ask him? There's no more time. Tempest let out a long sigh. With your inadequate mana, it would be impossible for you to have summoned me. I forcibly opened the door to come here, so now I have to close it. Answer me before you go. I told you I don't know, so why do you keep asking me? I would also like to ask Vermouth why he did that. The wind was fading into nothingness and Tempest's voice came drifting in and out. Next time, when you have enough strength. Eugene grabbed onto something to steady his swaying body as he glared down at W.E. Then, let's meet again, sometime. You motherfucker. Unable to hold it in any longer, Eugene spat out a curse. Tell me the full story before you leave. The wind finally vanished. And Eugene passed out with a nosebleed. Chapter 25. When Eugene woke back up, it was in the bed he had been using for the past few days. Nina, who had been waiting at his bedside, let out a startled gasp and was about to call for someone, but Eugene immediately raised his hand to stop her. Please keep quiet, Eugene groaned. Allow me to call someone for assistance, whispered Nina. No, it's okay, refused Eugene. Just stay still. Nina let out a confused noise. Huh? Stay still and don't say anything. Forcing out these words, Eugene clutched his aching head. His memories weren't clouded, and Eugene clearly remembered what he'd been doing just before he collapsed and the contents of his conversation with Tempest. But that still left him with a throbbing headache along with a hollow feeling of emptiness inside his body. This would have been an unfamiliar sensation for the 13-year-old Eugene if not for his memories as Hamel. This feeling was mana depletion. He had managed to squeeze out what little mana he had until there had been nothing left. This is all because Tempest just had to show up in person. All his mana had been sucked dry just by opening the door to the spirit world. From there, Tempest had taken over and crossed over into the physical world for a short time under his own power. Doing this had placed quite a considerable burden on Tempest as well. Even spirits with great strength weren't able to open the door to the spirit world by themselves. But as someone who had become a spirit king, Tempest was able to push the door open further by placing the burden for doing so on himself. It looks like Tempest must have been quite excited as well. Tempest had recklessly shouldered the burden and forcibly widened the opening to descend to the physical world and confirm the truth for himself. That was how much Tempest, the Wind Spirit King, had been alarmed by Eugene. No, Hamel's reincarnation. It would have been shocking for him to see that I was reincarnated with memories of my past life intact, but the fact that I was reincarnated as Vermouth's descendant must have made it seem even more so. Spirits remembered people by their souls, So Tempest had managed to recognize the one wielding Eugene as Hamel. This fact had Eugene grinning broadly. After accepting that he had been reincarnated, Eugene hadn't been able to shake off a few lingering unpleasant concerns. Was he really Hamel? The Hamel seen in his memories of a past life from 300 years ago? What if he wasn't reincarnated and was just someone who had Hamel's memories implanted into him? Even if that's the case, these memories are definitely real, Eugene had reassured himself whenever these fears popped up. He had also comforted himself by saying that it wouldn't make any difference if he wasn't Hamel reincarnated. He didn't want to attach too much meaning to the uncertain nature of his existence. I think therefore I am. That belief alone would have to be enough. But Tempest called me Hamel, Eugene remembered with a grin. Those words had completely erased all those unpleasant concerns. Eugene shook his head with a carefree grin. Master Eugene, are you sure you're okay? Nina asked uncertainly. Eugene dismissed her concerns. I'm fine. How long was I out? About half a day. I must have made you all worry. The Patriarch and Master Guillaume have been staying in the annex, waiting for you to regain consciousness. They didn't need to do that, Eugene said, shaking his head as he looked over to the room's closed door. Thanks to the mana absorbed into his body, his physical senses had become even more sensitive. As a result, he could feel a few presences hovering impatiently by the door. Why don't you open the door? Eugene suggested to Nina. It looks like I've caused them a lot of worries. Those two had every right to be let in. Gilead had granted him a lot of conveniences, adopted him into the main family, and even given him WE. Then they had passed on the white flame formula that only the members of the main family were allowed to learn, and even opened up the ley line for him to initiate his mana. After having all this provided for his mana training, Eugene had still ended up collapsing. When word of this had reached them, Gilead and Guillaume had rushed over in alarm and were now waiting impatiently outside the door to check his recovery. As soon as Nina opened the door, Gilead and Guillaume rushed in. Upon seeing Eugene sitting up in bed, Gilead sighed in relief and approached him more sedately. Are you all right? Gilead asked in concern. Yes, sir, Eugene gave his reply with a reassuring smile. Although he wasn't able to personally check his appearance in a mirror, Eugene guessed that his face would appear like it had been drained of all its blood. Gilead and Guillaume both looked at Eugene's face for a moment before exchanging gazes. It was now Guillaume's turn to speak as he asked, what exactly happened? As they were leaving the ley line and returning to the annex, Eugene had seemed perfectly fine. However, not long after his return to the annex, Eugene had collapsed. Thanks to this, Guillaume couldn't help but feel a whole tidal wave of concerns. He was the one who transmitted the white flame formula to Eugene and guided him into forming his own mana breathing cycle. What if Guillaume had made a mistake during this process, which had led something to go wrong within Eugene's body? Although Guillaume had faith in his own abilities, he couldn't help but worry now that something had gone terribly wrong. I've already heard part of the story. This time Gilead resumed speaking. I was told that after you drew a large breeze suddenly started blowing. Was this because you summoned a spirit? Although he had expected such a question, Eugene hesitated for a moment without answering right away. How should he try and explain this? Did he really have to come up with a blatant lie? The Wind Spirit King descended from the spirit world, Eugene finally admitted. There was no point in divulging the whole story, but he had to say something. There were too many eyes who had seen Tempest's descent, and it was impossible for any other spirit to be able to provoke such a storm through their arrival on this plane. What? Gilead yelped. Eugene explained. He said that it had been a long time since he'd heard a summon, so he wanted to see who it was. What kind of? Gilead fell silent, too shocked to finish his sentence. Both Gilead and Guillaume couldn't help but be astonished. 300 years had passed since Vermouth had left them, so of course, more than a few ancestors in the direct line had wielded WD. Although this might be stating the obvious, most of them were able to summon the spirits of the wind with the help of WD. However, the expectations that the Wind Spirit King Tempest held for his summoners were just as lofty as his own royal standing. So following Vermouth, not a single ancestor had managed to successfully summon the Wind Spirit King. Guillaume gave an audible gulp and asked, "Is that really the truth?" He knew that Eugene would have no reason to tell such a lie, but the news was so shocking that Guillaume felt he had no choice but to ask. Yes, the Wind Spirit King, Um. Eugene trailed off. Eugene frowned, making it obvious that he was having some difficulty remembering. While tapping the side of his own tousled head in order to jog his memories, Eugene continued speaking. I think he said that I didn't have enough strength yet. And that next time, when I had enough power, he was looking forward to seeing me again someday. Then he returned to the spirit world. Haha. Gilead, who had been silently listening to Eugene's explanation, suddenly burst into laughter. While shaking his head, he plopped down onto a chair next to Eugene's bed. Eugene. You really are one surprising child, Gilead sighed in relief. Eugene didn't know what to say in response, so he just smiled. After staring at Eugene for a few moments, Gilead placed a hand inside his vest. I heard about what happened at the ley line from Guion. In less than an hour you were able to sense mana and make a core using the white flame formula. All that would have been shocking enough, but for you to attract the Wind Spirit King's attention as well, something like that happening was unprecedented. However, what about Eugene wasn't unprecedented? Winning the bloodline continuation ceremony as a collateral child, being adopted into the family, becoming the new owner of WYD, and receiving the white flame formula with the Leyline's assistance. All these things were unprecedented in the history of the Lionheart family. He went from sensing mana to accumulating it into his body in less than a day. That, too, is something unprecedented, Gilead reminded himself. Gilead felt nothing but pure pleasure at this news. The Wind Spirit King had taken note of this young child and had even descended personally to take a look at him. An event like this could even be considered the revitalization of the Lionheart clan. Drink this, Gilead ordered. When his hand came out of his vest, Gilead was holding a small-sized potion. Gilead explained, this will restore your depleted mana. However, you have to promise me that, instead of overdoing it, you will lie in bed for the next few days. But my body feels fine. I still want your promise. If you injure your body by needlessly overburdening it, you will regret it in the future. Fine, I promise. Without any further protest, Eugene nodded his head. The mana recovery potion was just as valuable as it was useful. Eugene gulped down the whole bottle under the watchful eye of Guion and Gilead. His hollowed-out body started to refill with mana. Without getting flustered, Eugene immediately began using the white flame formula to recharge his core with this mana. But the mana from the potion wasn't enough to fully restore his depleted core. Due to the nature of mana, the amount that could be contained within the potion wasn't all that great. Even so, after emptying the entire bottle, his headache and the stiffness in his limbs were considerably relieved. After a few days' rest, Guion will resume your lessons, Gilead said as he stood up. Initially, we were planning to go on another training trip once the bloodline continuation was over, but now, it looks like that will be impossible. Is it because of me? Asked Eugene. That's right. I think that we will need to prioritize cultivating your talents instead of our own training. I don't want to take up too much of Patriarch and Sir Guion's time, Eugene admitted shyly. Don't think of it like that. After all, I'm the one who really wants to guide you personally, Guion spoke up. He patted Eugene on the shoulder with a grin. Guion added, but of course I'll be teaching Sin and Seal right alongside you. And the Patriarch will also be helping with our lessons. Eugene was certainly special. However, it wouldn't be good to show Eugene excessive favoritism because of this. The eldest son Ued had left the main estate and headed to Arath, but Cyan and Seal were still staying at the main estate. They also deserved to receive the same level of teaching as Eugene. I expect it will be a good stimulus to have Eugene train alongside those two, Gilead thought. After hearing that Eugene had returned from the ley line with impressive results after spending less than a day there, Cyan and Seal had immediately headed to the gymnasium and started their own training. So Gilead was also nursing high expectations of both Cyan and Seal. Sometime after Gilead and Guion had left, Eugene called out, Nina. Please allow me to go and prepare your meal, Nina offered. Good, but before you do that, Eugene said as he got out of bed and picked up W. Keep whatever happens from now on a secret between the two of us. Yes, sir. Even if I collapse again, don't tell anyone. Do you really need to try to do something like that now? Nina asked in concern. I just need to check something so I probably won't fall unconscious again, Eugene reassured her before infusing mana into WD. Luckily for him, there wasn't a repeat of the previous incident. But Eugene's brow still furrowed at this as he felt a slight dissatisfaction. Instead, a spirit that was only the size of his palm began hovering around him. It was a sylph, a lesser spirit of the wind. Composed of a mass of wind, it didn't even have a proper shape. However, with Eugene's small amount of mana, it was normal for him to have summoned a sylph. Just in case, Eugene tried to mentally ask the sylph, "Hey, have you heard anything from your king?" However, there was no reply. It seemed that it was impossible to converse with a spirit that had such low intelligence. With a click of his tongue, Eugene brandished Wngwiti. Eugene began his test by calling out an incantation in his head, "Wind Blade." Once he had done so, an opaque stream of wind formed around his sword. Eugene glanced down at this wavering blade-shaped wind before giving it a swing. The eerie sound that the blade made as it swung through the air caused Nina's body to tremble. After swinging Wngyd around a few more times, Eugene released the sylph back to the spirit world. Before doing so, he attempted to mentally communicate with it once more. "Pass this message on to Tempest. If you were lying to me, I'll kill you." But the sylph still didn't reply. However, it appeared to sense that its king had been insulted, as it sent a gust of wind to ruffle Eugene's hair before returning to the spirit world. Though Tempest shouldn't have any reason to lie about that, Eugene admitted to himself. It was just that Eugene couldn't quite understand what he was feeling, so he felt like he had to say something. While feeling a mix of complex emotions, Eugene sat down heavily on the bed. "I need to think about this rationally," Eugene told himself, without letting any useless emotions get in the way. 300 years ago Hamel died. His companions, Vermouth, Sienna, Anise and Molin, continued to make their way to the castle of the Demon King of Incarceration. It had to have been a tough journey. The second-ranked Demon King of Incarceration was strong enough that none of the previous Demon Kings of fury, cruelty and carnage could compare to him. Just getting to his castle was as difficult as slaying one of the previous Demon Kings. And with me dead. Speaking objectively, Hamel had been strong. Although he wasn't as strong as Vermouth, he was easily the next strongest in the party. So with Hamel dead, the remaining four may have found it impossible to deal with the remaining Demon Kings. They would have already been exhausted from making the torturous trek to the Demon King of Incarceration's castle, and Hamel had perished before the battle. In such a state, it was questionable whether they would have even been able to defeat the Demon King of Incarceration. In that case, wouldn't it have been better for them to retreat for the moment and reconsider their plans? So did everything really end there? With only Hamel having perished, Vermouth and the other four had returned from the Devildom of Helmuth after making some kind of mysterious promise. However, the only ones who knew the details of this promise were Vermouth and the remaining Demon Kings. But really, what was in that oath? That was what bothered Eugene the most. For the Demon Kings who lived to cause the world suffering, what on earth could have made them change their minds and swear to uphold the peace? Who exactly was the one who proposed such an oath in the first place? What were the contents of the oath? It all comes back to Helmuth. Just thinking about it by himself wouldn't bring him any answers. The memories of his past life clearly ended when he had died in the Demon King of Incarceration's castle 300 years ago. As for the events after that, most of what he knew came from the contents of the fairy tales that the young Eugene had read. "I need to find some time to go to Helmuth," Eugene finally decided. 300 years ago Helmuth was a horrifying place. Demonic beasts whose only purpose in life was to catch and eat humans roamed the land, and the demon folk inhabiting that land were constantly marching out to invade human territories. Fallen wizards, now known as Black Wizards, hunted humans to offer them as tributes to their masters, the Demon Kings. These evil wizards wanted to become demons themselves, so they sought the truth of the demonic path. Even if it meant bending the knee to the Demon Kings. Helmuth had been a twisted hell of such vicious and ugly desires. However, that was no longer the case. Since 200 years ago, Helmuth had begun accepting human visitors, and the Demon Kings and the demon folk showed such hospitality to their visitors that it seemed as if they were trying to overcompensate for their past cruelty. Nowadays, people didn't think of Helmuth as a hellish place. Instead, they thought of it as a tourist destination where one could experience unique, seductive and decadent entertainment that couldn't be found anywhere else. The demon folk who had once taken the initiative to invade human territories were now volunteering their services in neighboring countries as reparations for the war. And the black magicians who had been wagging their tails for the Demon Kings had cast themselves as victims and, after managing to sway public opinion, They had even managed to eventually erect the Black Tower of Magic in Arath. In Eugene's opinion, all of this was complete bullshit. The demon folk were volunteering to work? They were definitely siphoning off human souls behind the people's backs. The Black Tower of Magic? It would be better to call it a black swamp of corruption. Even though they said it was for the sake of promoting the study of magic, it was apparent why those crazy bastards in Arath had welcomed the Black Wizards and averted their eyes from these same wizards' past crimes. Although the truth hadn't been revealed, Eugene was sure that there must be all sorts of ugly things hidden behind the construction of the Black Tower of Magic. Helmuth, Arath, Uraz, and the Ruhr. As Eugene recalled each of the places where his former life's companions had left their traces, he clicked his tongue in irritation. Of course, he couldn't just set off immediately. With his young body, it was impossible to head off alone on a journey to such distant countries. But someday, Eugene told himself with determination before letting out a deep sigh and patting his stomach. His empty stomach was rumbling in hunger. What exactly should he say to Eugene? After leaving the banquet, this worry had kept Cyan up for most of the night. Although he had barely managed to get some sleep, that damn dream had ruined his rest. In that dream, Cyan had dueled with Eugene and lost once more. Except this time Cyan was a minotaur instead of himself. Within the dream, he had personally experienced the scene he had witnessed during the bloodline continuation ceremony. After becoming a minotaur who couldn't use sword light, Cyan was brutally dismembered by Eugene. Torn into pieces mercilessly. As he emerged from the gymnasium, Cyan attempted to shake off the last vestiges of his dream with a shudder. However, the frown on his face remained as heavy as ever. As he rubbed his eyes, which had been skewered multiple times during his dream, Cyan bit his lip in frustration. "What's going on, brother?" Seal suddenly asked. "Nothing is going on. Why are you asking?" Cyan responded defensively. "Your expression looks like it belongs at a funeral, and you didn't have much for breakfast either." "I've always had this expression and I ate just as much breakfast as I usually do." "Liar," accused Seal, sticking her tongue out at him with a smile. "I know what's really going on with you. It's because of Eugene, isn't it?" Cyan bristled. "What does any of this have to do with him?" "They said that we will be learning together with Eugene starting from today. I know that you're really bothered because of this. I said that it doesn't have anything to do with him. See, you've lost your temper quicker than usual. Why are you taking your anger with Eugene out on me?" "I haven't lost my temper. But you don't deny that something is bothering you?" "That's..." Hesitating, Cyan clenched his fists as he glared at his cheeky younger sister. "Honestly, it does bother me. But Mother said you need to become friends with him," reminded Seal. "Do you think I can really do that just because she tells me to?" "I did. Would you like me to put a word in for you with Eugene?" "What are you going to tell him?" "I'll just ask him to be friends with my brother." Cyan's shoulders slumped at these words, and his fists started trembling in embarrassment. Although he might be able to ask his mother to do something like that, Cyan definitely couldn't allow his sister, who was a few seconds younger than him, to make such a humiliating request. "I'll do things my own way," Cyan spat out before immediately clamping his lips shut. He had just caught sight of Eugene walking over from the far-off annex. Cyan's eyes widened as he caught sight of WMD hanging from Eugene's waist. Even at this distance he could make out all the tiny details of that famed weapon. "They told me that he's already a first star in the White Flame formula," Seal chimed in beside him. "I know," Cyan gritted out. "Didn't it take us a really long time to reach the White Flame formula's first star?" "It wasn't that long. Since it took us around a month, that means only a handful of our ancestors in the direct line were as fast as us. But Eugene didn't even take a day to reach the first star. Doesn't that mean he's the fastest in history?" "Just be quiet. I heard this from Uncle Guillaume, but apparently, Eugene was able to feel the mana as soon as he sat down on the ley line. It took us more than 4 days, right?" "So what?" Cyan responded in a sharp voice as he turned to stare at his younger sister. Seal just giggled in amusement at her older brother's reaction. Instead of continuing to tease her brother, Seal waved at the approaching Eugene and called out a greeting. "Hi. Why do you plan on staying in the annex? You should just live with us in the main family's mansion," Seal said to Eugene once he got closer. Cyan immediately replied in Eugene's place, "That's a terrible idea." After glancing at Cyan with hooded eyes, Eugene nodded and said, "I also think that would be a terrible idea. But I think it would be great, Seal insisted with a grin before pointing to W. So, I've heard that you were able to summon the Wind Spirit King using WYD? That has to be a lie, just like last time, Cyan replied instead of Eugene. Although his heart was slowly opening up to Eugene, Cyan absolutely couldn't bring himself to change his hostile behavior. Cyan was too young to understand his feelings of awe for Eugene, and it was even harder for him to identify the dawning sense of respect that he felt because of this. Except for the Great Vermouth, none of our ancestors could summon the Wind Spirit King while wielding WE, Cyan cited as evidence. Eugene snorted at these words and drew WE. This startled Cyan into leaping backward away from him. What do you think you're doing? Cyan demanded. Instead of replying, Eugene infused his mana into WD. Soon after, wind gathered into the form of a sylph. Seeing its appearance, Cyan inwardly felt relieved and burst out laughing. What is that? The Wind Spirit King, he asked mockingly. Nope, came the simple reply from Eugene. Eugene held up WD so that it could be seen clearly, and the sylph proceeded to wrap itself around the sword. Cyan's jaw dropped as he took in this blade of wind. SW Sword Light. Cyan exclaimed in shock. Does this really look like sword light to you? Eugene asked mockingly. Cyan's face reddened as he felt the tables being turned on him. While swinging WD around a few times, Eugene stared firmly at Cyan. Shall we spar? Eugene offered. It. Cyan choked in panic. You can feel free to use sword light because I'll be using this. When Cyan remained silent, Eugene coaxed, why don't we just have some fun? Or if you'd like, we could bet on it. If you win, I won't. Cyan immediately stepped back while shaking his head. I've come here today to learn from Uncle Guion. I'm not here to spar with you. Eugene grinned. Are you scared? I'm not scared, Cyan replied hesitantly while urgently sending Seal a pleading look. He was hoping that his sister could somehow salvage this situation. However, Seal just ignored Cyan's glance and smiled in amusement. That evil bitch. Fortunately, before Cyan was forced to make any excuses, Eugene backed down and gave him an out. Let's not argue pointlessly, Eugene said with a sigh. Cyan couldn't think of anything to say. We're brothers now, so we should try to get along, said Eugene with a broad smile as he offered Cyan his hand. For a few moments, Cyan alternated between staring at Eugene's hand and face. Eugene eventually asked, Don't you know what this handshake means? Huh. Cyan seemed confused. It means that I want us to get along well as brothers. Oh well, that's... After some hesitation, Cyan eventually took Eugene's hand with a grateful nod. Shake hands with me as well, Seal demanded, cutting into their conversation from her position at their side. This request forced Eugene to cross his arms so that he could hold both Cyan and Seal's hands simultaneously. Since I was born earlier than you should call me your big sister, Seal brought up once more. Eugene refused. Would you shut up about that? Didn't that mean he was Eugene's big brother? Although Cyan felt this thought pop up in his head, he decided to keep his mouth shut when he saw Eugene's narrowed eyes. He definitely didn't have the audacity to claim Eugene as his younger brother. Chapter 26. Time sure flew quickly. Eugene suddenly had this thought as he looked in the mirror during the early hours of one morning. He casually tidied up his shaggy mop of hair as he stared at his own face in the mirror. He was now 17 years old. 4 years had already passed since the end of the bloodline continuation ceremony and his adoption into the main family. Although his face still looked like that of a young boy's, his body was almost fully grown. As Eugene examined his own wide chest and broad shoulders, for a moment he was overcome by his emotions. This really is a great body. This was a topic that he had thought of several times over the 17 years he had lived in this body, but he never got bored of repeating this fact within his head whenever it came up. First of all, he had a handsome face. Eugene wasn't just saying that because it was his. Even if he was forced to look at it objectively, he would have to admit that his features were good-looking. Although he felt that Hamel's face from his past life wasn't all that ugly, comparing that face to his current face after being reincarnated as Eugene, the difference in their looks was about as much as the difference between an ordinary elf's and a human's. Though not as much as an elf compared to an orc. Eugene had no desire to disparage the face of his previous life to that extent. After patting his smooth cheeks a few times, Eugene started stretching his facial muscles by pulling all sorts of expressions in the mirror. The nasty look in his eyes when he frowned hadn't changed at all since childhood. It was just a part of his innate character. Despite going around with narrowed eyes ever since he was young, Eugene was just glad that he didn't have any wrinkles. I had an even nastier look in my eyes during my previous life. Relaxing his frown, he gave a broad smile instead. But was this handsome guy in the mirror really him? Although he had already graduated from truly thinking such nonsensical thoughts, even after 17 years of living in this body, he still felt amazed each time he saw this handsome face in the mirror. I have to admit it, your blood is strong, Eugene thought as he raised his eyes to his gray hair. The older he grew, the more prominent the gray hairs became. Every time Eugene saw this hair color, he was reminded of vermouth. Eugene had his reasons for indulging in such self-absorbed sentiments this early in the morning. After initiating his mana when he was 13, Eugene had trained his mana every morning without skipping a single day. And today, Eugene had finally reached the 3rd star in the white flame formula. That was quick. He could feel the split-off cores circling around his heart. 3 points of light that showed he had reached the 3rd star of the white flame formula. Way too quick. After he had started to train his mana, Eugene had realized something. The white flame formula's performance was incomparable to the mana training scripture he had learned in his previous life. Eugene was able to extract the optimal degree of efficiency from just a small amount of mana, and the speed with which he absorbed mana was also extremely fast. The cost of spreading this absorbed mana throughout his body and turning it into strength was also not very high. However, for him to have achieved this rank so quickly, it couldn't just be attributed to the superiority of the white flame formula. It was also because Eugene's body was naturally attuned to absorbing mana. Although it's great that this body's performance is so amazing, sometimes he couldn't help but feel perturbed. If it's already this fast, just how much faster will my progress be later? It would be the opposite of subtle. But this was actually quite a pleasant issue to be perturbed about. Eugene smiled as he looked at his reflection. But the strength I had in my previous life won't be enough. This amazing body had been granted to him, Eugene Lionheart, and it had given him a lot of expectations for his future. With this body, he couldn't be satisfied with just relying on the memories and experiences of his past life. Eugene had become convinced of this fact years ago. Hamel had definitely been a great talent. Although he wasn't as good as Vermouth, he had also known how to wield all sorts of weapons. Without any formal training, Hamel's skills had been forged and honed on the battlefield as he towed the line between life and death. This meant his techniques had been refined through constant usage. Hamel had made a name for himself with just these skills and had even come to mistake himself as a genius. It was at this point that he had met Vermouth, and Hamel had suddenly realized that he wasn't a genius after all. After becoming Vermouth's companion, he had also gone through a lot. His techniques had been further polished, and he'd added even more skills to his repertoire. But it's still not enough. It wasn't enough to just acquire the strength he had in his previous life. To take advantage of this talented and greed-provoking body of his, he needed more than just his past life's memories. I need to learn everything. And not just to a basic level either. The sword, the spear, the axe, and the bow. He already knew how to skillfully handle most weapons. He had confidence in his weapon techniques since he had refined these skills in order to not just survive but thrive in the Devildom. But he wasn't quite there yet. Although he was still a little slower than he had been in his previous life, he knew in his head how to get there. It was just a matter of when, not if. His body would catch up to what he knew it was capable of. So if he would eventually get there anyway, wouldn't it be more efficient to use his time elsewhere? Looks like I need to learn some magic, Eugene suddenly spouted. What kind of bullshit is that? Cyan gasped. As Cyan sat on the ground trying to catch his breath, he lifted his head to look up at Eugene. The monstrous guy standing beside him wasn't showing any signs of exertion even after all the exercise they had just done. At first, this would have made him flare up in envy, but now, after 4 years of looking at that relaxed expression, he was already used to it. I said that I need to learn some magic, Eugene kindly repeated. And I said, what kind of bullshit is that? Cyan spat out with a confused expression on his face. Eugene wasn't the only one whose body had grown during these 4 years. Cyan had also grown a lot. Of course, it was obvious that Cyan didn't really appreciate this fact, and Eugene was a big reason for that. Although they might be of similar age, Cyan was just a tiny bit shorter than Eugene, and the difference in their skill levels was just as great as ever. Speaking of this morning, Eugene continued speaking without offering Cyan a hand up. Cyan was still a brat with too much self-respect. He wouldn't admit he had lost even when he was defeated, and he wouldn't appreciate it if Eugene offered him a hand up. Even though Cyan would no longer fuss about being insulted or whatnot, like what had happened when they first met, it would only stoke feelings of frustration lingering within the corners of his heart if Eugene were to show him any kindness. I was just training in the white flame formula like I usually do. Could it be, did you really? Cyan couldn't finish the question. Cyan's eyes started trembling as he got a bad feeling. Gritting his teeth, he jumped to his feet. Eugene smiled as he saw Cyan getting flustered like this. And then this happened. As Eugene finished speaking, the mana that was usually spread throughout his body gathered near his heart. Once there, the 3 stars at his core began to resonate with each other. These stars, locked together in a circuit around his heart, began to explosively amplify the power of his mana. Fwoosh! Mana, in the form of pure white light, engulfed Eugene's entire body. Cyan stared at this sight with wide eyes. The white flame-like light wrapped around Eugene's form looked like a flowing lion's mane. What the fuck? Cyan swore, his voice shaking. Since he also practiced the white flame formula, he was well aware of what that mana cloak engulfing Eugene signified. By covering his body in a blaze of mana like that, he had truly created a fiery beacon that honored the name of the white flame formula. This meant that Eugene had reached the 3rd star of the white flame formula. Is that even possible? Cyan asked in disbelief. Cyan was so ashamed that he felt like he would be better off dead. He had initiated his mana 7 years earlier than Eugene and had been training in the white flame formula for nearly as long. Thanks to this, he had managed to reach the 2nd star of the white flame formula 3 years ago. But until now, Cyan's progress had remained stalled at the 2nd star. The stars around his heart seemed like they were just about to divide, but they never did. But instead, that annoying son of a bitch, Eugene, who had initiated his mana 7 years later than Cyan, had already reached the 3rd star of the white flame formula. Of course it's possible, Eugene said with a relaxed smile as he allowed the mana to dissipate. Because I'm a genius. Eugene thought declaring something like that from your own mouth was rather shameful. Or at least he used to think that. But now he had to admit that it would be ridiculous to pointlessly act humble. He had been born with the body of a genius, and on top of that he had memories of his past life. Although Hamel from his past life wasn't a genius, Eugene definitely was. Why don't you just go and die? Cyan cursed. Eugene chided him. Brothers shouldn't say such things to each other. Like you can talk about what brothers shouldn't do. Every morning you beat me up so badly that it feels like I'm going to croak. Aren't you the one who keeps asking for a spar every morning? If you don't want to get beaten up, let's just stop. It doesn't matter to me. Cyan ground his teeth as he glared at Eugene. Challenging Eugene to a spar every morning was Cyan's own way of dealing with the frustration of his rivalry with Eugene. Honestly speaking, Eugene appreciated this change in Cyan's attitude. At first he thought that Cyan was just a stupid brat, but perhaps because he had come to accept Eugene after the adoption, Cyan's foolish streak had shown a lot of improvement. But why magic of all things? Cyan returned to the main point. Because I've never learned any magic, Eugene explained. So that's why you want to learn magic? Don't make me laugh. And how exactly do you intend to learn magic? Do you want to call up a teacher from the capital? I'll need to check with the patriarch regarding that. Are you really serious? No, but why on earth do you want to learn magic all of a sudden? Cyan just couldn't understand Eugene. Since he had that much talent in martial arts, why would he want to dabble in magic instead of focusing on what he was good at? Cyan tried to dissuade Eugene. Aren't you too old to be learning magic? 17 is still plenty young, denied Eugene. This is nonsense. Have you forgotten about what happened to Ued? Cyan asked with a snort as he dusted off his pants. He went off to learn magic when he was 15, 2 years younger than you are now, and now he's just being treated like a fool in a Roth. Eugene glared at Cyan and growled, Bastard, how dare you say such a thing about your older brother? Did I say anything that wasn't true? Cyan protested while shrugging off Eugene's glare. Instead of putting on airs and pointlessly heading to Aroth to learn magic, just stay here at the main estate where it's comfortable. If you really do tell him that you want to start learning magic, father might just start crying tears of blood. That did seem to be a possibility. 4 years ago, Uod Lionheart, the eldest son of the main family, had accompanied Lovelian, the head wizard of the Red Tower, to Aroth as soon as the bloodline continuation ceremony was over. But in the end he couldn't become Lovelian's disciple. It seemed that his potential wasn't bad as he had been allowed to remain in Aroth, but he couldn't become as big of a success as his parents had hoped for. Now 4 years had passed and Uod was still staying in Aroth. According to what Eugene had picked up in passing, he was currently learning magic from a wizard affiliated with the Red Tower of Magic, but he didn't seem to be achieving much progress. Thanks to this, it wasn't just Lovelian's authority as the head wizard that had obviously been affected, but the main family's prestige had also been tarnished. Although the patriarch had just done his best for his eldest son by using his connections to send him to the Red Tower of Magic to learn magic, to others, it appeared as though the patriarch was getting rid of a mediocrely talented heir by exiling him to the Red Tower. Even if the patriarch does shed tears of blood, Madame Ancilla should end up supporting me, Eugene commented. I could see Mother doing that, Sion mumbled with a needlessly wary glance at the main family's mansion. However, it isn't that my mother dislikes you, Eugene objected, but sometimes when we cross paths she gets a really fierce look in her eyes. That's because she's seen how you beat me like a dog, argued Sion. Even if she has, what can I do? How can I just stop beating you when you keep asking for it? You son of a bitch. It was admittedly Sion who had asked him to take their spars seriously. This was because Sion had thought that his skills wouldn't grow if Eugene kept taking it easy on him, but for a long time now Sion had come to feel deep regret for saying something like that. Eugene showed absolutely no mercy during their spars. If he even saw a tiny opening he would pierce through it right away and keep attacking mercilessly. While doing so, Eugene would also constantly point out Sion's various inadequacies. Still, because Eugene explained his criticisms clearly and in a way that was easy to understand, Sion was forced to listen to him silently even when he felt like his heart would stop beating out of anger. Eventually Sion asked Eugene, "Do you really intend to go to Aroth? If you're going to learn something you should learn it properly," was all Eugene needed to say in explanation. If you wanted to properly learn magic, the best thing to do would be to go to Aroth. And there's also something that I want to investigate, Eugene thought to himself. He wanted to see what Sienna's life had been like in Aroth following their journey. This desire had been building up within him for a long time. And it wasn't just Sienna but Anise and Molin as well. He wanted to know how his companions had lived their lives after they returned from the Devildom 300 years ago, and ultimately, he wanted to know the truth of what had happened then. Even here at the main estate there are hardly any records of them. The history of the founding ancestor Vermouth was also left very vague. Although he had searched here and there during these 4 years, there were hardly any traces of what the hero and his companions did after returning from the Devildom. And this necklace as well. Eugene stared down at the necklace hanging from his neck. He had constantly worn the necklace since he retrieved it from the treasure vault 4 years ago. Even when the head wizard of the Red Tower had personally peered into the memories left within the necklace's mana, Lovelian hadn't been able to find any memories identifying it as Hamel's keepsake. This meant someone else had created an undetectable false layer in the necklace's memories. From what Eugene thought, the only people who could do something like that were Sienna or Vermouth. But why on earth would they have done it? He couldn't figure out what their reasons for doing so might be. However, if he had to say it, Sienna seemed more likely to have prepared such a prank in the necklace rather than Vermouth. The Vermouth that Eugene remembered wasn't the type of person to do something like this. If you do go to Aroth, Sion coughed before continuing with a hesitant expression, Seal will be sad. Really, Eugene said with a laugh for how absurd Sion's claim sounded. Are we talking about the same Seal, the one who looks disgusted whenever she sees me? Those aren't her true feelings. Although he said this, Sion didn't seem to have any confidence in his own words. Seal Lionheart, that cunning brat, seemed to have started going through puberty at the beginning of this year. She no longer stuck close to Eugene like she used to, and she wouldn't even start a conversation with him. Perhaps it was because the symptoms of her puberty were quite severe. She rarely even left her room. Although Seal didn't neglect her training, she no longer trained with Eugene and Sion as she had done before. I hate the smell of sweat, was the reason that she had given for it. Thanks to that, Guion and Gilead were forced to keep very busy. They first met with the puberty-stricken Seal in the morning and spent half the day teaching her while the other half was spent teaching Sion and Eugene. Anyways, if you do go to Aroth, Seal will be sad, Cyan insisted. Do you really think I'll change my mind just because Seal will be sad? Eugene asked. You heartless bastard, Cyan spat as his fists trembled in anger at Eugene's careless comment. Have you even considered how Mr. Gerhard will feel? My father will be perfectly fine without me. Even Cyan couldn't help but agree with that. Gerhard had initially been uncomfortable with living at the main estate, but he had become completely accustomed to life here over the past few years. Now he regularly went on hunting trips with the heads of the other collateral families, and he sometimes spent whole nights drinking beer with Guillaume and Gilead. Even Ancilla got along quite well with Gerhard. Of course, Eugene was well aware of the reason for this. Ancilla didn't wish to show much hostility to Eugene. Although she hadn't relaxed her considerable vigilance towards him, she knew that it was better for both of them if they appeared to get along than to appear openly hostile. However, Tanis, as Euid's mother and the official first wife, was openly wary of Eugene and Gerhard. Following Euid's failure to become Lovelian's disciple, Tanis' overly sensitive personality had continued to worsen. Looks like I'll need to be a little careful of Tanis, Eugene reminded himself. If she was told that Eugene was going to Aroth, Tanis would definitely become even more sensitive to the threat he posed to her son's candidacy. This wasn't a problem that Eugene could simply solve by paying more attention to her. Instead, this was something that he would have to secretly entrust to the patriarch Gilead. Where are you going? Cyan asked as he noticed Eugene beginning to walk away. To meet with the patriarch, Eugene explained over his shoulder. You're going to meet with him right now? I need to get his permission quickly after all. With this final reply, Eugene left the gymnasium. After staring absent-mindedly at Eugene's receding back, Cyan gave a deep sigh. What the hell is with this bullshit about learning magic? Cyan grumbled and began following after Eugene.